At 17, Gualterio crossed the border holding a flower in his hand and a heart filled not just with dreams, but also fear. Not the kind of fear that paralyzes, but the kind that settles in your chest and turns into drive, into courage, into necessity, the kind of fear you inherit when you're born into a poor home, where adults keep certain truths to themselves and children grow up knowing nobody is coming to save them. He was from Oaxaca in southern Mexico, from a dusty neighborhood with dirt roads where days dragged on, jobs were scarce, and neighbors shared the bit of corn they had. He lived in a little house with a tin roof, unpainted block walls, and an improvised bathroom in the yard. His mother, Doña Carmelita, washed other people's clothes when her health let her. Lately, her cough kept her up all night. She coughed so hard, it felt like something inside her was tearing bit by bit. Still, she refused to go to the hospital. She said medicine was for those who could pay. She had to look after her children. She couldn't afford to be sick. If you enjoy interesting stories, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Gualterio was the oldest of 5 siblings. Since he was 10, he worked at the market carrying bags or sweeping stalls. He learned not to beg, not to cry, not to complain. Sometimes he went to school, sometimes not. It depended on whether there was work. But something inside him, a faint, almost invisible flame, made him dream of a different life. Not luxuries, not fame. He dreamed of having a room of his own, of seeing his mother sleep peacefully, of sending his siblings to school with new shoes. That was enough. That was his idea of happiness. Deciding to head north wasn't his choice alone. It was everyone's. One night, after the power went out for the 3rd time, his mother called him into the kitchen, eyes brimming with tears. She told him there was no future for him there, that if he stayed, he would end up like his father, who left one day looking for work in Sonora and never returned. She handed him a small cloth bag with 3 changes of clothing, some carefully saved money, and a paper flower. It wasn't just any flower. It was made by his 6-year-old sister Sophia, who took a sheet from her notebook, colored it with crayons, and folded it unevenly. "So you won't forget we love you here, Gualti." That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the door hugging his backpack while his mother made tortillas and brewed coffee in an old pot. There were no tears, only silence. Nobody wanted him to leave, but everyone knew he had to. He left before dawn, when the sky was just starting to lighten. He walked to the bus station and met a neighborhood acquaintance who was also planning to cross. They paid a coyote who promised to take them as far as Arizona, and from there they'd continue on their own. The trek was inhuman, days hidden in stash houses, drinking dirty water, barely speaking above a whisper. They slept on the floor among strangers, everyone wearing the same expression of someone who'd left everything behind and didn't know if they'd arrive. They crossed the desert at night. The cold was brutal. His feet bled, his lips cracked from the dryness. Yet he never complained. He thought of his mother coughing, of Sophia's paper flower, of his siblings' empty stomachs. That drove him onward. Once in the U.S., the group scattered. Nobody wanted to get caught. He made it to Tucson, then Dallas, and finally, thanks to a distant cousin's contact, he took a bus that left him in the Bronx, New York. He arrived in midwinter, having never felt such cold. The wind pounded him, as if punishing him for crossing without permission. He had a borrowed jacket, 2 $20 bills, and a folded paper listing addresses he no longer understood. He walked for hours, lost. He didn't speak English, could barely decipher signs. At every corner, he paused, watching hurried faces, cars passing without stopping, shops closing abruptly. He'd never seen anything like it. The city seemed a monster, both beautiful and cruel. He slept in train stations, sharing the ground with others like him, learned to heat soup with hot water from public restrooms, to ask for leftovers wordlessly, to hide fear behind a smile. One night in Grand Central, he pulled that paper flower from his pocket. He'd carried it all this way without crushing it. It was his only treasure. He gazed at it for a long time. He didn't cry, but felt something inside him break. He had no idea how long he could last, or whether he'd ever keep his promise. But he silently swore he'd do the impossible. "I didn't come here to fail, I came to endure." On New York's icy streets, he learned to survive like so many others, empty-handed, hungry, clinging to hope by a thread. He had no papers, no friends, no home, but he had an urgent need to send money back home. His mother needed meds. His siblings ate once a day. Each call from Oaxaca was both encouraging and desperate. One morning, leaving the subway at 14th Street and Union Square, he spotted a Hispanic woman selling flowers wrapped in colored paper. She had a cardboard box at her feet, timidly offering them. He stood there, hidden among the crowd, over an hour, and saw that nobody bothered her. She sold, sometimes little, sometimes more, but she sold. That afternoon, he went to a Latino market in Queens and, in broken Spanish, asked if anyone sold flowers wholesale. A man sold him 20 battered roses for $5. "They're my extras. Take them, kid, see if you get lucky," he said. So Gualterio took them, went back downtown, and stood near Times Square in the cold with those roses, not really sure what to do. "A flower, miss. It's pretty like you," he'd improvise, repeating lines from movies or picking them up by ear. Sometimes women ignored him, sometimes they gave him a pitying smile. A few customers bought, more out of compassion than the roses worth. By night's end, he'd sold 9, enough for some bread, coffee, and a less hungry sleep. He soon learned flower selling wasn't just a transaction, it was an exercise in patience, dignity, and resilience. The roses were his tools, but he was really selling an experience. He gripped their thorny stems in his cracked hands and spoke sincerely. "Flowers bring peace. Truly, I'm not lying." People stopped, initially skeptical, but his voice was gentle. He had a way of looking people in the eye without aggression or desperation, as though he knew something they'd forgotten. It wasn't long before the police noticed him, a dark-skinned youth, no license, on a busy corner, speaking with an accent. More than once, they snatched his flowers, shoved him against a wall, threatened to arrest him. He never argued, never raised his voice, just gathered his things and moved on to another street. He slept for months in cardboard boxes, hidden among Bronx alleys or building entrances. He used a gas station restroom if the clerk felt kind, bathed in public sinks, washed his clothes by hand in subway bathrooms. Some days he sold nothing. Others, he barely made enough to eat and send a bit home. One especially rough day, a woman bought 3 flowers and asked him where he was from. With shaky English, he answered, "Oaxaca, Mexico, very poor. I came to help." She nodded, touched his shoulder, said something he barely caught. But the way she looked at him made him feel seen, if only for a second. He still had the paper flower from Mexico, folded in his old backpack. Sometimes he'd pull it out and stare at it, not out of nostalgia, but to remind himself why he'd crossed. Whenever he felt he couldn't go on, he took it out and talked to it, as if speaking to his little sister. Thus, day after day, block after block, he became part of the urban landscape. The flower boy, always greeting everyone, always claiming flowers could heal the soul. Some believed him, some didn't. Many people sought him out anyway. Nobody really knew his story or imagined that each flower he sold was a piece of his life, offered with a smile that covered sleepless nights, beatings, rejections, and the fear of not knowing if he'd make it to tomorrow. But he carried on, every single day, against all odds. 5 years passed since that first shaky day he stood on a Manhattan corner with battered flowers in hand. 5 harsh winters, suffocating summers, roofless dawns, endless uncertainty. 5 years hauling roses, lilies, carnations, and his own story on his back, but he never gave up. He learned to read the city's rhythms, to sense the cops' schedules, to spot tourists versus locals, to pick up English phrases faster than he expected. He saved every penny like a jewel, sleeping as little as possible, eating only what he had to, never buying new clothes. Everything he earned, he split between remittances to his family and a fund hidden in a cookie tin behind a false wall in the room he rented with 3 other migrants. There, in that hideaway, he counted his money with the devotion of a child caring for cherished toys. It was thanks to an unlikely friendship that his life started changing. Pedro, an Ecuadorian with papers who worked at a flower shop, had known him since those early street-selling days. They shared corners, instant noodles, even tears in the rain. Pedro had gotten legal status through marriage, and one day told him, "You've got something special, brother. You're not just selling flowers. You talk to them, feel them, arrange bouquets like poetry. Why not open your own stall? I'll help." Gualterio hesitated. His fear was huge. He had no papers, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't get licenses, but Pedro offered to do it in his own name, legally, while Gualterio put up the soul of it. Using what he'd saved, they rented a small place in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, barely 10 square meters, a cracked display window, walls smelling of damp. But to him, it was a castle. They spent weeks getting it ready, painting with borrowed brushes, repurposing shelves from an abandoned warehouse, building a work table from pallet wood. On one wall, he hung the paper flower his sister Sophia gave him the day he left. It was faded, discolored, but still intact. "It goes here, so I never forget why I started this," he murmured, gently touching the brittle paper. That was how Esperanza Flowers was born. The name wasn't random, a tribute to his sister, yes, but also everything that flower had meant in his darkest hours, the will to keep going, faith in the impossible. The first months were tough, with minimal sales. Some days passed without a single customer, but he persevered, leaving early to buy fresh flowers in the Bronx markets, carrying buckets of cold water, sweeping the entrance 3 times a day, and arranging bouquets with near-artistic care. He had a gift. He could look at a person and sense which flower they needed. One day, a crying woman came in without speaking, and he handed her a bouquet of white lilies without asking why. She hugged him, though they were strangers, and whispered, "Today's my daughter's anniversary. You have no idea what this means." From that moment, customers trickled in bit by bit. Neighbors first, then people from other boroughs, until one day a wedding planner accidentally stopped by, bought a bouquet, and ended up hiring him to decorate an entire event in Queens. He worked through 3 sleepless nights, and when it was done, the woman cried upon seeing the arrangements. "Nobody's ever understood what I wanted so well without me saying it." Despite all the praise, he never revealed his immigration status, not even to Pedro. He only said someday he'd fix his papers. For now, he wanted to focus on work. He knew any slip could ruin everything. He stayed alert, always afraid, but he didn't show it. He basically lived in that tiny flower shop, almost never leaving. He had a cot in back where he slept with a tattered blanket, ate at the same counter where he assembled bouquets, his hands covered in scars from cutting thorns and using scissors. He never complained. Everyone walking through the door got a warm smile, a kind phrase, and a carefully wrapped flower, wrapped almost maternally. His English was still limited, but the language of flowers was universal, and in that language he was a master. Thus, gradually, the young man who'd crossed the border clutching a single flower and hunger in his belly started building something real, something nobody could take away. Success came faster than he'd dreamed. One morning he awoke on the cot behind his Brooklyn shop, looked at the calendar, and realized nearly 7 years had passed since that first shaky sale on a Manhattan corner. What had once been a forgotten nook with random buckets and tangled stems was now a store bursting with life, color, gentle aromas, and people who came not just to buy flowers, but to feel heard. Esperanza flowers became well known among New York's Latino community. His flowers graced weddings, funerals, hospitals, anniversaries, and reconciliations. He refused to just sell bouquets. He always asked. He listened. He cared about each flower's backstory. People, as hurt and lonely as he once was, found comfort in the silent humanity he offered without asking for anything in return. Soon came bigger orders. A chain of restaurants used him for corporate events. A famous artist mentioned him in an interview after receiving one of his bouquets. Word spread on social media about the humble Latino who turned flowers into art. He barely understood the digital world, but Pedro and younger acquaintances promoted him online. And suddenly, he was admired. Earnings climbed, and he took a huge step, opening a second location in Los Angeles, California, where a distant cousin lived and offered to run it. Pedro flew out to help with paperwork. The place was small, but in a busy area, and within 3 months, it was profitable. Later, an opportunity arose in Reno, Nevada. A married couple, regular clients, wanted to partner with him on a franchise. Cautiously, he agreed. They took out a loan under Pedro's name, plus the couple's, and opened the third Esperanza Flowers, a more modern setup with 6 employees and contracts with local hotels. The nickname came soon after. A local magazine first called him El Rey de las Flores, the Flower King. He found it a bit awkward, but people repeated it proudly. Customers waited just to take selfies with him, greeting him like a celebrity. He wasn't comfortable with fame, but never refused a handshake or a smile. He remembered the real cost behind each success, sleeping on damp cardboard, wearing torn boots, suffering humiliations. But as his floral empire grew, so did something else: fear. Beneath the successful businessman's facade, the gentle voice, the admired man who handled luxury weddings, hid a silent, cutting truth that pulsed like an open wound, a deportation order. Years before, his first attempt crossing via Detroit ended in a Border Patrol capture. They took his fingerprints, held him briefly, released him with a notice to appear before an immigration judge. Ignorant and scared, he'd signed paperwork he didn't fully understand, never reported to the judge, and carried on. That order, signed in trembling blue ink, was never cancelled. It still lurked, years later, in some system, some dormant federal file. So far, he never told Pedro or his new partners, nor any accountants or his cousin in L. He lived in constant anxiety that any random raid, routine check, anonymous tip, or mere data match would drag it all into the light. He sometimes dreamed of ICE agents knocking on the door, woke drenched in sweat, convinced he'd heard his name on a police loudspeaker, memorized escape routes from his shops, kept a backpack with some cash, a copy of that paper flower, and a few shirts, just in case. The paradox was cruel. The bigger his name got, the smaller he felt inside. One day, Pedro found him behind the shop, eyes distant. "You okay, brother? I'm just tired." Tired or scared? They locked eyes for a few seconds, and for the first time in years, Gualterio didn't smile. Both. He said nothing else. He couldn't. Fear was now a tenant in his soul. No matter how many flowers he sold, how many adoring clients he had, or how many shops he opened, he knew he was precarious. His castle, no matter how lovely, was built on shaky legal ground. Each morning, unlocking his flower shop doors, he took a deep breath, clenched his fists, told himself, "They're not going to take it all away from me today. Today, I'm still El Rey de las Flores." He was at his peak. Esperanza Flowers arrangements were everywhere. Celebrity events, conferences, consulate banquets, luxury hotels, even local politicians' funerals. People invited him to Latino business fairs, photographed him for Hispanic entrepreneur magazines, hailed him as a success story. Nobody knew his real story. To them, he was the migrant who'd realized the American dream. To him, he was just a man who'd never had the option to fail. He was 42, married to Beatriz, a Dominican elementary school teacher he'd met delivering an order in Harlem. They fell fast in love. He had few secrets, except the biggest. He never told her about the deportation order, not out of mistrust, but fear. Fear of losing everything, fear of upending the peaceful life they'd built. They had 2 children, Mateo and Camila, both U.S. born, raised among flowers, laughter, and stories about a place called Oaxaca they only knew from their father's tales. They owned a modest house in Queens, with an American flag beside a statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Everything finally seemed fine, until it wasn't. It was a grey October morning, the kind that warns winter's on its way. As usual, Gualterio arrived at his Brooklyn shop before sunrise, carrying coffee in one hand and a bouquet for a rush order in the other. He saw an official-looking white envelope slipped under the door. The moment he touched it, he sensed it wasn't ordinary mail. He opened it, trembling. Notice to appear, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Order to appear before an immigration judge. Case reactivated. Name, Gualterio Hernandez Jimenez. Deportation order issued in Detroit, year 1999. The world stopped. The words swam before his eyes. He couldn't breathe. A sharp ringing filled his head. The shop, the flowers, the shelves vanished, as if someone had yanked away the illusion of stability he'd fought so hard to build. No mistake about it. Under Trump's administration, new policies ramped up arrests and deportations of people with old orders, ignoring how long they'd lived here or how much they contributed. All it took was an algorithm or a fingerprint check. The past he'd thought was buried roared back to life. That night at home, Beatrice saw his pale face, his vacant eyes. "What happened? Are you sick?" He showed her the paper. She read it silently, pressing her lips together, then sank into a kitchen chair. She didn't cry right away, just whispered, "How long have you known about this?" "Since before I met you. But I thought it was forgotten. I thought it went away." They talked for a long, painful stretch, many silences. In the end, she didn't blame him. She hugged him, said they'd fight, she wouldn't let him go through it alone. Word spread like wildfire among his employees, neighbors, loyal customers, partners in L.A. and Reno. An entire community mobilized for him, prayer chains, vigils, collections. Kids from the neighborhood made posters with flowers and wrote messages. Flowers shouldn't be uprooted. Pedro, that old friend, contacted an immigration lawyer. A digital campaign took off. Local news covered his story. Videos of employees praising him circulated online. His wife wrote a letter to the judge explaining how he'd built not just a business, but a family, a home, a network of hope. His children recorded a trembling-voiced message. "My dad isn't a criminal. My dad sells flowers. My dad is my hero." His flower shop became a hub of resistance. Each arrangement sold now came with a special card, for peace, for love, for Gualterio. Even local politicians voiced support, saying you can't throw out someone who's contributed so much. He was living proof of thousands of migrants working in the shadows, raising families, shaping the future. But the law was cold. The judge had received the file, the hearing set, time running out. For the first time since he arrived, Gualterio wasn't sure he could stay. The federal courtroom in Manhattan was packed, too crowded for a Wednesday morning. Dozens of people filled the wooden benches, some standing, some on the floor, holding handmade signs. Flowers for Gualterio. No flower deserves to be uprooted. This man sowed love. He doesn't deserve exile. Among them were neighbors, employees, colleagues, teachers, journalists, mostly Latinos, migrants like him who felt they too were on trial. In the center stood Gualterio. He wore a freshly ironed white shirt, gray pants, worn but polished shoes, no tie. In his left pocket rested the paper flower folded so carefully, the same one he'd carried from Oaxaca, that had survived every battle and which now accompanied him on his hardest day. His wife, Beatriz, stood beside him, eyes swollen from sleepless tears. Mateo, their eldest, ground his teeth to keep from crying in public. Camilla wasn't there. She was only 8, and Beatriz didn't want her seeing this. At that age, she thought, children must still believe the world is fair. The judge, a gray-haired white man with a worn, tired expression, took his seat. He'd seen too many cases, too many tears, too many arguments. He knew this hearing would be different. He'd read the file, the letters, the videos, the press coverage, knew who this man was. The defense lawyer, a young but firm-voiced woman, rose. "Your Honor, Mr. Hernandez Jimenez poses no threat and has broken no law since that border crossing over 20 years ago. He's paid taxes, created jobs, started a family, taken an active part in his community. He's not just a number in a database. He's a father, a husband, an example." She paused. "We're not asking a favor. We're asking for humanity." The prosecutor, predictably, was brief and matter-of-fact. "The law is the law. Mr. Hernandez Jimenez received a notice to appear in 1999, didn't show. An automatic removal order was issued and remains valid. The Department of Homeland Security requests it be enforced without exceptions." Silence. The judge exhaled, scanning his notes. Then he asked if Gualterio wished to speak. He stood. He didn't tremble, didn't shout. His voice the same gentle tone as always, calm, patient, almost poetic in its simplicity. "Your Honor, I was 17 when I came. I spoke no English, didn't understand the laws. I only knew my mom was sick and my siblings ate once a day. I arrived scared, cold, holding a paper flower from my little sister so I wouldn't feel alone. And I still have it." He pulled out the folded paper. A stir ran through the room. "I started selling flowers on the street, got beaten, humiliated, slept under staircases, but I never quit because this country taught me that despite everything, there's space to plant something good. I worked non-stop, built a store, then another and another. Along the way, I formed a family with love, with honesty. If you're enjoying this story, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our content." He locked eyes with the judge, his gaze carrying the weight of years, not tears. "I didn't come here to hide. I came to work, to support mine, to spread beauty where there was none. I'm not just a number, Your Honor. I'm a man, a father, a husband, a citizen of this country, even if I don't have a paper saying so. Everything I did here, I did with dignity." A heavy hush fell. The judge lowered his eyes, fiddling with his pen. Nobody moved or breathed. Seconds stretched before he spoke. "Mr. Hernandez Jimenez." Pause. "Your story moves me deeply. If I followed my heart alone, you wouldn't be here. But my decisions aren't guided by feelings, they're guided by law. And the law, though sometimes unjust, binds me." He closed the file. "The deportation order remains. Your appeal is denied. Mr. Hernandez Jimenez must leave the country within 30 days. Beatriz broke into sobs. Mateo buried his face in her shoulder. A collective sigh like a wave of resignation swept the room. Gualterio said nothing, only nodded, head held high, fingers touching the pocket that held the paper flower, the same one that now, more than ever, reminded him who he was and all that he was about to lose. Oaxacan sunshine shows no mercy, not to the trees or the rooftops or a man returning in defeat. It was around 1 in the afternoon when the plane landed. The hatch opened with a harsh click, and a hot gust hit Gualterio's face like a memory he hadn't asked for. He paused in the doorway before stepping onto the tarmac, eyes closed, inhaling deeply. The smell was familiar, dry dirt, wood smoke, a hint of longing on the breeze. He was back, not by choice, not by fate, but by decree. He stepped down slowly, carrying only a small carry-on and a single-strap backpack. It didn't contain valuables or electronics, just 3 printed photos of his children, a box of seeds his employees at the New York shop had given him as a symbol of resilience, and the paper flower his sister Sophia had given him years ago. That flower, now yellowed with brittle edges, still guided him. It had followed him everywhere, and he wasn't about to let it go now. The airport terminal seemed somewhat modern, but the pace was the same. People drifting, board officials checking documents, clueless tourists. Nobody was there to meet him, nobody hugged him, no one shouted his name with joy. It was a silent homecoming, as if returning to a house where no one lived anymore. He took a battered taxi with ripped seats and a rosary dangling from the mirror, gave the driver in a low voice the address, San Martin, Mexicapam, on the outskirts. No conversation. The driver barely glanced at him. The heat was thick and stifling. Gualterio felt weighed down by something intangible, the sum of years, exile, defeat, familiar yet unfamiliar streets, newly paved avenues, others in disrepair. House colors changed. Many businesses he remembered were gone. The neighborhood he'd once known as safe now felt like a dimly lit stage, everything smaller, quieter, sadder. When the taxi stopped by the house where he was born, he hesitated. The gate was rusted, part of the side wall had collapsed, weeds covered the yard, nothing was left of the home he'd known. He walked to the door with dragging steps and knocked once, twice. Nobody answered. He knew his mother was gone. He'd learned that over a distant phone call, but never seeing her, not getting a final goodbye, tore at him like fresh loss. A neighbor, Doña Berta, emerged from her home and eyed him a while before speaking. "You're Gualterio, oldest of Doña Carmelita." He nodded. "We thought you'd never come back. Your mother died years ago. Your siblings. They each went their own way. Nobody lives here anymore." Her words fell like stones. Gualterio said nothing, just lowered his gaze, feeling a lump in his throat. He entered that house like entering a deserted temple. Cracked walls, caved-in roof, dust draped over everything like a shroud. He sank to the floor by the old fireplace, staying there for hours. He didn't cry, only breathed, as if each breath were an attempt to find meaning amid the emptiness. That night, he slept on an inflatable mattress lent by a neighbor. There was no electricity. He lit a candle and placed the paper flower beside it, as he'd done so many times before. He stared at it for ages, then took out his phone. The signal was weak, but enough for a video call. His children's faces appeared. Camilla broke down the moment she saw him. Mateo tried to stay composed, but his lips quivered. "When are you coming back, Daddy?" "I don't know, my love, but I'm here and you're with me, always." Beatrice came into view, eyes red. "We're okay, Gualti. The store's still running. People ask for you every day. You're not alone, not forgotten." After the call, silence crept back. This was his land, but no longer his home. Over the next few days, he wandered the town searching for work, even if temporary. Nobody recognized him as the Flower King. To them, he was just some older man with a worn face and a mixed accent. He offered to tend gardens, fix planters, teach neighborhood kids how to plant. He did it not for money, but so he wouldn't disappear. He bought soil, pots, basic tools, started planting flowers in the main square. Nobody asked him to, nobody stopped him either. Kids came around out of curiosity. Some called him the Plant Man, Others just watched from a distance. He'd calmly teach them how to prepare the ground, care for seedlings, respect each flower's cycle. Sometimes, after finishing, he'd sit under a tree with his seed box at his side, set the paper flower between his knees, and close his eyes, thinking of his kids, his wife, every customer who'd once entered Esperanza Flowers. Then, not out loud, only inwardly, he'd remind himself, they haven't fully deported me, so as long as they remember me, I'm still there. Early morning light tinted the hills around San Martin Mexicapam as Gualterio opened the door to his old house, whose damaged walls he was fixing little by little with his own hands. The once overgrown gate now opened without squeaking. He'd planted bougainvilleas out front. He said flowers were the only way he could keep talking to the world. He had turned the village square into his open-air workshop. Every day, with disciplined routine unbroken by time or sorrow, he pushed a wooden cart lined with bright cloth. On it, he placed that day's creations, simple but well-matched bouquets, all from the small patch of fertile ground behind his house. His method, rise before dawn, brew pot coffee with piloncillo, check each flower's condition, decide which would star for the day. He was no longer young. Wrinkles deepened on cloudy days, the humidity paining his bones, hair salted with grey, hands hardened by earth and the years. But he had a quiet dignity that commanded respect, even when he said nothing. At first, locals watched him warily. Some knew his name from stories they'd heard on social media, repeated by journalists or relatives. Others found him mysterious. An older, solitary man who arrived daily with flowers and gentle words, never asking for anything, always giving. In time, he became part of the scenery. The market women stopped by to greet him. Kids paused to smell the flowers and play with the ribbons. A few aimless teens started approaching, not to buy, but to learn. He welcomed them without judging, the way a flower waits for its season. He taught them pruning, removing thorns without snapping stems, blending colors like a symphony. It's not just about selling, he'd tell them. Each flower has a purpose. You have to listen to it. It'll tell you if it's ready to go. He spoke like a teacher, but also like a father. In every gesture, every tip, he was sowing more than flowers. He was sinking roots. Sundays, he made small bouquets for baptisms, communions, local celebrations. Sometimes he got a few coins, often nothing. He said every flower he gave was another way he could remain useful, remain tied to a world that sometimes felt it no longer needed him. Once, during a church event, a young mother holding a baby asked for a simple arrangement to thank the Virgin. He gave her one of white roses and orange blossoms. Upon seeing it, she cried, "My husband's in Los Angeles. We haven't seen him in years. You reminded me of him, gave me hope." That left him torn up inside for days. Nights were a different realm. After switching off the lights, he lit a small candle by the window. Sitting on a wooden chair he'd repaired himself, he'd write letters in a worn hardcover notebook with yellowed pages from the city. Not letters to mail, confessions, conversations with a future that might never come. He wrote to his children, to Beatrice, to himself. "Today Camilla sent me a recording of her playing the piano. I listened 5 times in a row. I close my eyes and see her in front of me wearing her blue dress, with braids, laughing. Mateo told me he helped decorate the Brooklyn shop. It's looking beautiful. I could only send a voice message back. My voice shook, and I didn't want them to notice. I told them I was fine. I lied. But in a way, it's partly true." He sometimes thought of asking them to visit or just Camilla, but he'd back out. Why bring them to see their father living like a shadow? Why have them witness a land that expelled him when he was a kid? He feared their illusions might crumble at the sight of his stripped-down existence, a single bare room, a table with one candle, a battered flower cart. Feared the sadness of reuniting might outweigh the power of longing. So night after night, he wrote what he couldn't say, planted what he couldn't reclaim, and clung to that paper flower as though it were the sole bridge connecting him to all he had lost. He knew he'd never be the same man who'd crossed holding a paper flower and soared among roses and orchids, crowned the Flower King. Now he was just another gardener in a forgotten southern corner. But he also knew, and never doubted it, that as long as a flower blossomed in his hands, he'd go on blooming, however silently. Meanwhile, in Oaxaca's slow rhythm under the scorching sun, and roosters crowing at dawn, the name of Gualterio Hernandez Jimenez started circulating beyond the flower shops he founded in the U.S. What began as a quiet local story grew unexpectedly strong, turning into a banner for something bigger. It started with a post by his son, Mateo, one night when sadness overtook him. After spending hours handling store finances, coordinating deliveries, setting orders, he sat at the computer and wrote, "My dad was deported over an order from more than 20 years ago. But he's not illegal. He's the most honest, hard-working man I know. He sold flowers on the street, built a business, raised a family, employed people, and never asked anything in return. Now we carry on his legacy. Every flower we sell bears his name, because even if they took him from this country, they'll never take him from our hearts." He attached a photo, Gualterio holding a bouquet of daisies with the paper flower from his sister in his shirt pocket, taken one of his last days in New York, unaware it would become his most emblematic portrait. The post went viral within days. Thousands shared it, commented, cried, made it their own. Migrants nationwide, many in similar straits, saw themselves in Gualterio. He wasn't just a guy with flower shops. He was living proof that quiet struggle leaves deep marks. Proof you can lose everything and still be huge. Media outlets, Spanish and English alike, picked up the story. Univision, Telemundo, CNN and Español did special segments. They interviewed Beatriz, Mateo, employees of Esperanza Flowers, neighbors. Some reporters went to Oaxaca searching for him. Faithful to his nature, he declined interviews. "I'm no news," he'd say. "I'm just a man who wanted a quiet life, and now I'm learning to be far away." But his absence spoke louder than any interview. In the Bronx, a mural appeared, painted by young Latino hands on an entire school wall. At its center was an imposing portrait of him, arms wide, surrounded by children, flowers bursting from his hands, and a phrase in white letters, "They tried to uproot one of us, but ended up planting thousands." His shop stayed open. In Brooklyn, the original store, Mateo managed things with a maturity beyond his years, having learned every aspect of the business as if he'd been doing it for decades, knowing each client, their favorite flowers, special dates, replicating his father's arrangements with near religious dedication. Every purchase included a little note written in Camilla's hand, "For love, for beauty, for Gualterio." It was no longer just a decorative phrase, but a rallying cry. Some clients bought flowers just to receive that message. Others paid in advance so random strangers could have free bouquets. A network of anonymous good deeds formed in his name, a wave of kindness fueled by his story. People who'd never met him wrote letters of support, sent them to Beatriz, to Mateo, and somehow they reached him in Oaxaca too. There, in his homeland, he went on with his modest life, rising at dawn, mixing homemade compost, carefully pruning, teaching local kids to cultivate flowers from scratch. No social media or cable TV. News from up north felt like it was from another world, one he no longer belonged to yet, which still breathed his name. When he saw pictures of the mural, the posters, the message-laden bouquets, his eyes filled with tears. He read each word, touched them like relics, then stored them in a cardboard box under his bed alongside the paper flower that had stayed with him since childhood. He never set out to be anyone's symbol or martyr. His way was always about work, quiet gestures, offering others beauty without wanting credit. Yet there he was, turning into a seed of something bigger. His story written on walls, invoked in marches, mourned on altars, celebrated in classrooms. Immigrant rights activists used his image as a banner, not because his case was tragic, but because his integrity was profound. He was living evidence that deporting him wasn't punishing a criminal, but a decent man. In every talk she gave, Beatrice repeated firmly, "They didn't take him from just me. They took him from an entire community, from this country, from every flower that won't feel his tenderness, from every customer who won't hear his voice, from every child who won't learn from his hands." Each time she said it, the applause wasn't mere approval. It was respect. Meanwhile, in Oaxaca, he kept planting, teaching, scribbling letters he never mailed, saving voice notes he wouldn't play in public. When townspeople asked why he still gave away flowers free of charge, he always had the same reply: "As long as a flower stands, I do too." He didn't need passports or documentation to make a mark. He did it by how he looked at you, by how he cared, how he stayed, even when they tried to erase him. And in that quiet act, in that loyalty to who he was, he became more than a story. He became a seed. And seeds, as we know, always find a place to blossom. Oaxaca's sky was silent, not the frightening kind of silence, but more like the land exhaling gently after rain. A warm afternoon, still air, and the smell of fresh blossoms drifting on the breeze. On a little hill overlooking San Martin, Mexicapam, stood a tree with generous foliage, a jacaranda whose purple petals fell like rain onto the dry ground. Beneath it, perched on a time-worn rock, sat Gualterio. He held a red rose, not freshly cut, not perfect, just simple, short-stemmed, its petals at full bloom before wilting. He cradled it gently, as if holding a memory. At his feet lay a battered wooden box with gardening tools, a notebook of yellowing pages, and a pouch of seeds. Next to him was the paper flower, now encased behind a bit of glass he'd fashioned, like someone protecting something sacred. Below stretched the town like an old painting, tin roofs, bright walls, kids playing in the street, hawkers calling out wares. Nothing felt urgent. Everything moved at the rural pace, with the acceptance of those who know how to wait. He gazed out at the horizon without thinking of yesterday or tomorrow, just breathing. He no longer asked about his case. Appeals were denied, no more resources left. Some insisted a political change might let him return. Others said it was best not to risk it. His lawyer still messaged him occasionally, but he never asked about dates or possibilities. He'd stopped counting days. Not that he'd lost hope. It was more that he'd realized something deeper. He didn't need to return physically to remain present. He was already there in every flower sold under his name, in every retelling of his story, in every child learning to plant with soil-stained fingers. Mateo had promised to keep the shops going, and he did so. Beatriz remained strong, leading firmly. Camilla sent him songs, which he sometimes softly hummed while watering his small nursery. And whenever he video-chatted with them, though it tore him apart, he always smiled. He'd accomplished something he never planned. He'd transcended, not through money or fame, but love, the kind that shows in small daily acts, like watering a flower, teaching a youngster, hearing someone out, or staying after everyone else leaves. That afternoon, under the tree, a timid step sounded behind him. Don Gualterio? A boy no older than 10 stood there, carrying a small potted plant with young leaves. "My mum says you know how to keep it alive. Please help me." He smiled, asked the boy to sit. He examined the plant, showed him how to water without drowning, how to talk to it, move it into sunlight, and let it rest. The kid listened with the awe of someone hearing magic. "Did you learn all this in America?" the boy asked. "No, I learned it as a child at home before I left. What I learned up there was not to give up, and to remember every flower, no matter how small, has a purpose." The boy left hugging his plant, promising to return. And Gualterio, still holding that simple rose, went back to gazing at the horizon. Nobody knew if he'd ever cross that border again, ever see New York once more, or hold his kids without a screen between them, but he no longer lived waiting for that. He understood at last that the mark he left needed no physical presence to grow. He'd arrived in the USS with a paper flower. They kicked him out empty-handed, yet he left an entire garden planted in hearts that would never forget him. His story doesn't live in files or court rulings, it lives in every flower that still blooms in his name. Because there are some things that can't be deported, and true love always finds where to flourish. If you enjoyed this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Until next time.